The Galaxy Z Fold 4 is probably one of the most exciting phones that has been released in like recent memory, but 6 months on, what is it like to use? Folding phones aren't a new concept. In fact, they've been around for years. However, Samsung have absolutely nailed it with the design and almost like the excitement of this phone, because most phones now are just a little bit drab and a bit boring, but the Z Fold 4 is in that tier of phone that is absolutely unreal. It gives you that excitement every time you open it up and realize, oh, I've got a tablet just sat in my pocket. And so far, every time I use this phone, I just remember how fun it is to use something that's different and a little bit more exciting. And that is what this Z Fold 4 gives me. And setting all that aside, I want to talk about what this phone is like to use over the last 6 months or so. And there's a couple of plus points, there's a couple of negatives, but let's start with one of the biggest plus points, shall we? And have a look at the display. On the Z Fold 4, you are treated to two 120Hz display, a 6.7 outer screen, and a huge 7.6 120Hz inner folding display. And as cool as that huge display is on the inside of the phone, I actually find myself using that outer display a little bit more than I thought I would. And the reason I tend to use it more is because actually when you just need to, I don't know, change a song on YouTube Music, or you just want to quickly go onto Spotify or send a message through WhatsApp, that outer display is way more convenient than just opening up that 7.6-inch display as you're walking down the road and trying to send a text that way. So that's why this outer display gets a little bit more action. The outer display though on this Z Fold 4 is quite a tall display, so trying to use it with one hand in terms of trying to get to the top of the screen is pretty much impossible. And that's not necessarily a negative, but this one for some reason just seems a little bit taller than everything else. But because of how tall that display is, it also means it's quite thin as well, which might be seen as a bit of a negative, but actually for me it's a massive positive because you can use it and hold it really comfortably in one hand rather than it being a little bit too wide. So using that display on the outer screen is actually a really nice experience. Now that inner display, and I get asked the same questions all the time. Is the crease annoying? Can you feel the crease? Don't you see the crease all the time when you're on the phone? And actually the answer to all of those questions, no. You just don't really even realize that that crease is part of the display. Samsung have said that the crease is needed to try and keep the phone water resistant, and actually the crease, it just blends in like a notch would or a hole punch cutout. You just kind of don't even remember it's there. And I'll be honest, I'll hold my hands up and say actually if you're scrolling through the phone and you put your finger through the middle of the display, then yes, you can actually feel it, but that's obviously a crease, it's physically there, so you will feel it. But I found myself either using like the left or the right hand side of the screen. I very rarely are putting my finger down the middle of the screen, so for me personally I barely even recognize it's there. I am though still a little bit scared when using that display because it is glass, but not like glass as we know it. It's quite soft, so if you end up pressing a little bit too hard with your thumb or like a fingernail in there, then you can absolutely ruin the display. But once you get over that fear, wow, it's just like having an iPad with you all the time whilst not realizing you've got an iPad. And it comes in so handy when you're like traveling and you want to watch a video. You can start watching it on that outer display, then realize actually I'm pretty chilled, let's open up and carry on watching it on a big display. And as much as I love that inner display, I don't think I take advantage of it as much as like someone else would, because a big part of having that big screen is multitasking. And multitasking, don't get me wrong, for some people is really useful, but I've barely used it. Being able to have a split screen app, so YouTube on the top, Twitter on the bottom, for some people will be really handy. Having a web page open on one half, notes on the other, again, I can see why that is really useful, but I've tried to get into it and I just can't. It just seems like it's a little bit too messy for me. I would rather use that taskbar at the bottom of the display and switch between apps rather than having two open at the same time. Right, now let's talk about one of the biggest things that people will always speak about on a phone, and it is the cameras on the Z Fold 4. And with the cameras on this phone, I kind of think for £1,600 that you pay for it in the UK, you would expect better cameras. I'm not saying that you need better cameras, but I think that you would prefer to have the cameras that are on like the Galaxy Ultra phones than the ones that are on the Z Fold 4. It has a 50 megapixel main, a 12 megapixel ultra wide, and then that 10 megapixel 3x optical zoom. And don't get me wrong, when you see the pictures that the cameras take, you're not going to look at the pictures and think, oh, I wish I had a 108 megapixel camera like the Ultra phones have. But for that price, you might want it. The 10 megapixel 3x optical zoom camera does a pretty decent job of taking photos in, I'd say, decent light, and then that is the same for that 12 megapixel ultra wide as well. I say this on videos all the time and I'll always say it, I'm not a big camera guy. Maybe I should be, but I'm not. And if you want to take photos on this and just upload them to Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all of that stuff, then it's going to be absolutely fine. It does have as well that under the screen selfie camera, which I actually forget is even there most of the time because it is actually really well hidden. Except when it's on like white backgrounds or something that's light, that's when you can see it a little bit, but on anything that's darker than that, you just forget it's there. And I love the idea of that hiding camera, but it does take a quality hit, and to be honest, it's not great. If you want to take a selfie, close the phone and just use that front display camera, because that is so much better, because the quality of that inner selfie camera is pretty bad. Let's talk about the video, and the Z Fold 4 gives you some really good options in what you can do with video. It can do 8K at 24 frames a second, which is great, but the files are huge, and actually the 8K on this doesn't look amazing yet. The 4K though at 60 frames a second is much better, and it has that little crop, but to be honest, it's pretty decent and really quite usable. I suppose the one thing that always seems to let me down though with video on a Samsung phone is the stabilization, and I don't think it's amazing, and maybe that's because we've been treated to stabilization from the iPhone for so many years, which is just miles ahead of everything. I mean, don't get me wrong, it is decent on the Z Fold 4, but it's not amazing. And just a few other things as well. So battery on this phone is absolutely fine. You can so easily get to the end of the day with a decent amount of battery. Obviously, the more you use that inner display, the more battery is used. So if you have like a good balance between the outer display and inner display, not a problem in terms of battery life. Right, my biggest annoyance on this entire phone is the speaker. I think it's rubbish. Like, I cover it up so much when I'm using that folding display, and even when I'm not covering up, it just sounds pretty empty. Like, it doesn't sound full, it doesn't sound like there's much bass on it at all, and for the price you pay for the phone, I want a better kind of experience in terms of speakers having that big display. The display is let down slightly by how bad the speakers sound, so hopefully they'll fix it on the Z Fold 5, but for now it's a little bit meh. And One UI is something that I'm starting to like a little bit more. The more time you give it, the better it gets. I think it just takes a bit of time coming from stock Android or from iOS as well. And I tweeted a couple of days ago that I absolutely hated it. The one thing that Samsung could do to improve their phones would be to get rid of One UI. But actually, I'm going to hold my hands up and I'm going to say I'm sorry, I was wrong. One UI is actually pretty decent. But like, conclusion of this entire phone. So it's one of those things where actually I'm now starting to look for phones that are more fun and exciting to use, because things like iPhone, they are boring. Yes, they just work, but they're a bit boring. I would take things being a little bit off and have a more exciting phone. And it's one of these things where if you want to pay £1,600 and can afford that and don't mind things being okay with terms of specs and cameras, then the Z Fold 4, absolutely go for it, because it is so fun to use. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Is this a phone that you've got? How's it holding up for you? Or is this something that you want to get but are still a little bit scared about that screen being damaged in the middle? Because trust me, it's scary, but once you get over it, it's actually fine. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like, and of course subscribe to the channel as well. And if you do all of that, then I'll see you later.